You're listening to the Physio Matters Podcast, this month in association with rehabmypatient.com, and this is session 99. Welcome back to the Physio Matters Podcast. I'm still Jack Chew. And yes, you heard that right, 99 consecutive months of Physio Matters. Of course, we've got about 200 episodes on this channel, but as far as the main show, once a month, first Sunday of the month, we're approaching that magic 100 episodes. And we're going to, I'm going to tell you something that's a big surprise, and this is probably the first place you're going to hear this, is that we're doing the 100th episode. And then that is us for that format. Big news. So to go out with a bang, we will be doing a 24-hour charity podcast marathon with all of your favorite guests from yesteryear, as well as all the people that you've requested over the years that we've never quite got round to. All of that is going to be all included in this massive extravaganza. Lots of fun stuff planned for that and planned for me for being on the microphone for 24 hours, including various different challenges, donation options, etc., where you can get me doing forfeits and all sorts of horrible stuff like that. So do check out our social media. Keep an eye out for that. We're going to be making lots of noise about it very soon. Also, if you've got any final guests and requests that you wish had been on the podcast over the years that we haven't got to, let us know. We'll get them invited to our 24-hour podcast marathon, which has half an hour slots in it, so people are booking in as we speak, and we've just got an absolute who's who, as you can imagine, as we have done in our back catalogue. They're going to be joining me as part of this big MSK extravaganza. Now, the 99th podcast, therefore, ends up being our last of this current format. Doesn't mean we won't ever do long-form podcasts again. Doesn't mean we're not going to be replacing it with something different. But it does mean that as far as the normal format of Physio Matters, 60 to 90-minute long-form interviews with the best and brightest in the game, usually one-to-one, this will be the last of them. And so we're going out with a bang on this, which is Jeremy Lewis. If you haven't heard of Jeremy before, where have you been? You've been hiding under a rock. As I said at the start of this interview, his name's synonymous with the shoulder. And someone that really, I found it really interesting because when preparing for interviews, I've got a few different styles and formats that I might use depending on the subject matter and the guest. And this, I decided to go down the line of when I've interviewed people like Sally Lime, David Beard, people whose careers have spanned clinical practice, but then research and have had a really interesting sort of thought journeys. And especially, I would say that Jeremy, like the people I've mentioned before, as well as other guests we've had on, they've ended up being fairly public people. As part of that, which means that then I was able to reflect on not just their literature back catalogue, but also just their changing views on various things, editorials, etc., as well as having seen and Jeremy's work presented at conferences, etc., by him and others. So it was a really interesting, meandering conversation, visiting all sorts of different topics and subjects that I found certainly interesting to hear his take on. And so I hope you enjoyed the episode. Of course, thanks as ever to our sponsor, Rehab My Patient. Incredible support from them over the years. Fascinating, and we would not have been able to do this without them. If you haven't already, then please do take them up on their 3-month free trial at rehabmypatient.com/Physio Matters for the best in class, easiest use software for exercise prescription in MSK practice, with all modules, even from some of your best and brightest favorites on Physio Matters, such as Joe Gibson, as well as modules to come from Brad Neil Salmon like Mehmet Cem, etc. So that's enough for me. I throw over to Jeremy Lewis, and this is the last intro of its kind, you'll be pleased to know, for those that always heckle me for having waffled through the intro. So anyway, you don't need to skip over any more intros. That's me done. Ta-ra. See you at the end. Delighted to be here today with Jeremy Lewis, whose name is increasingly synonymous with the shoulder and the upper limb generally. Someone who I've been really excited to talk to on the podcast, and for it to be on our 99th episode, which is the last of its current format on Physio Matters, our cumulative months. I can't believe it's been this long since we've had him on the full show. I did speak to Jeremy ahead of the iFOMP conference in 2016, in which it was a great conversation, and his keynote at that conference has certainly then influenced some of my thinking, because of the way in which he joined the dots between not just the shoulder, but how that fits to functional rehab of the whole person, and making sure we're holistic and not delineating people by body parts. So I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into a few things with Jeremy today. But for those that have been hiding under a rock in MSK practice and don't know who this man is, I'd just invite him to introduce himself first and foremost for the listeners.
Well, first of all, it's my honor, so thank you very much. It's a nice number to be in a podcast, 99.
Yes.
Wasn't there an ice cream called 99 at some?
Absolutely, that's the famous cone.
In Maxwell Smart. Did you have Maxwell Smart in the UK? Do you know who Get Smart?
I don't think so. I don't think I know that. No.
You don't know Get Smart? So Get Smart was part of my childhood in New Zealand and Australia. There was the spoof spy, and I think Get Maxwell Smart's girlfriend partner, her name was 99. But anyway,
forgive me. That might be might be an age thing. Even I don't know.
It's definitely an age thing. It's definitely.
If I should know it, then I'm sorry, but no, I didn't know that. But yeah, good number. It is a good number. I agree.
Yeah, it was a test, Jack. The fact that you didn't know it, I'm gonna be cutting this short. No, I think it might have been like MASH was really. I think that we were influenced a lot in Australia and New Zealand by American TV programs, and maybe it wasn't something that was here, but something to check out on YouTube. Gotcha. So I started life in New Zealand. I had a very lovely childhood in New Zealand, living by the sea, driving tractors when I was 8 years old, fishing for our street with the other boys in the street on a Saturday morning, driving at the age of 15, borrowing a cushion from my grandparents to shove under my bottom because I couldn't quite see over the steering wheel. Moved to Australia. There was a lot of economic migration from New Zealand to Australia. When I was a teenager, New Zealand economy wasn't brilliant, so my folks were part of that economic migration. And took a year off after school because I had no idea what I wanted to do. I thought medicine, then I bailed out of that. Dentistry, bailed out of that. I knew I'd want to do something in healthcare. And then I traveled for a year and met a nurse, and he took me to the hospital that he was working at and said, why don't you go and spend a morning with the physios? There was no such thing as, you could just, it was easy in those days to do things like that. And I saw this physio doing a wax bath for, I don't know if you even know what that is. For a woman with rheumatoid arthritis. And after 20 minutes, the wax was taken off, and this lady said, look, I can move my fingers. So I said, that's my profession. And in second year, when we did wax baths, I thought, oh my gosh, that's funny how decisions are made. But, looking back on it, I was lucky. It was, sliding doors, I guess, and it was a good sliding door.
For sure. And then obviously your career's come on quite a way since wax baths, and certainly
that was the high point, Jack. That was the high point.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I wish everything was quite as simple as wax baths, and that we
Isn't
thought
it?
that if only that wax bath was big enough for the rest of me is often what patients would say. But
what a brilliant idea.
There's an invention for you. Yeah. Absolutely. We're in a rush now between the two of us. We'll have to do it
No, I'm prepared to share.
Cut this out of the podcast. We'll cut this out of the podcast and go into wax baths, massive ones. But what then, because the gap between that and of course now is significant in years, sorry to say, but also in the journey you've had has made you then, as I mentioned, synonymous with shoulder, as I mentioned earlier. Obviously you don't have to rush there, but what led to that part of it? How did you become a body part specialist, shall we say?
Because at that stage in the 1800s, people were becoming. Why are you laughing? At that stage, people were becoming body part specialists. So people like my contemporaries or the people I looked up to and was learning enormous amounts from, people like Jill Cook was becoming a tendon specialist. Pete was becoming a back specialist. He was telling me things about doing doing special sacroiliac tests and all these special things that he was becoming specialist in those days before we all had our epiphanies. That's right. Epiphany.
Yeah.
And I really, really wanted to. So I spent the early part of my career wanting to be the best fixer I could be. I did every course. I bankrupted myself over and over again, doing every possible course, with a trigger point course, trigger point Mark II, all the different courses, because I wanted to be the best fixer that I could possibly be. And I was really interested in posture, and I was really interested in shoulder posture. And I thought my contribution to the world could be to demonstrate how posture was a problem, and it caused conditions such as impingement syndrome. And I thought that would be my research contribution. There was really no one else doing shoulders at that point. There was feet and ankle specialists, there was knee people, there were tendon people, there were back people. So I thought my contribution could be to find some answers around the shoulder. And my journey through my PhD suggested all the things that I thought I'd contribute, just really challenged what my expectations, my biases were going to be.
And it seems to be that there's rarely a middle ground in the shoulder, in that they've got highly interested specialists, but then there's some people that really load the shoulder and try and avoid it. You speak to people, it's a bit of a Marmite joint, Marmite body part. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
From my cultural background, please use the word Vegemite.
Sorry, Vegemite. Okay, yeah, fair play. Sacrilege for me to use that. But I think why I'm interested in asking as to why you might feel that is, whether you recognise that, whether it's something that there is a mystique that scares some people, but clearly there's some intricacies that clearly draw others in. Why might that be?
Yeah, that's really. I've listened to many of your podcasts, and you do have an ability to ask really very valid, important, poignant, and many other words starting with P questions. I
usually have one per podcast, so that's me done for the day.
Let's finish this early then. Yeah, I don't understand. I think I did understand in the early days, where everything was in a biomechanical silo, and I guess if it is in a biomechanical silo, then a joint with so many degrees of freedom and so many interconnecting bits and pieces would become a nightmare. But as against a knee that moves in one plane of movement as a hinge joint. I guess it's hard to remember exactly, but I can understand that nightmare of the biomechanics of the shoulder. But I think in more modern times, I guess the last 15, 20 years, when we understand that things are not necessarily, but are not in a biomechanical silo, we've got this Venn diagram of so many other, maybe even more important reasons why somebody might be disabled with symptoms in a particular region of the body. It shouldn't be more frightening or more complicated than any other region of the body. And I think it just depends how we frame or reframe what a musculoskeletal problem is, which I know you're championing with your with what you're doing, and I think everyone who's working towards that end point of maybe reframing musculoskeletal, it shouldn't be that problem that I still do course. I did a course this week in Rome, as I was mentioning, and it was interesting. Some people, when you go around the class in the beginning, people were saying, "Oh, I hate this joint, and I wanted to understand how to use it more." And people say, "I love it," and it's interesting that what you're suggesting is still occurring, but I don't think it should be like that anymore.
I think one of the things that I've observed is that it seems to transcend just our professional disciplines as well. It's like the patients of, especially say of sporty and fitness and things, and then you see the way that sort of the cultural moment with fitness influencers, even where the aspiration to sometimes overcomplicate for the sake of then applying expertise onto that complexity, but then also that there are some really quite disabling problems and conditions that can therefore sometimes surprise people, and they kind of didn't realize just how difficult life could be with sore shoulders, or how much it could limit their goals. And so I think that that's, for me, when I've reflected on a similar sort of topic, I can't help but wonder if that's sort of colouring things, and therefore the social expectation that comes to us as clinicians, where the pressure's on, and so therefore it sort of naturally surprises people across the board, professional and otherwise, that can do that. Is there something that you've seen over the years, trends for different styles of not just practice, but also like a sense of vulnerability that some people sometimes have over the shoulders, and then almost in the next minute there's people that just neglect it compared to, say, the back, which is otherwise inherently fragile? Like, has that been a bit of a moving picture as well?
Yeah, I guess. I think many people perceive musculoskeletal problems that have been given a structural diagnosis, a pathoanatomical structural diagnosis. I think that heightens people's fear, and the very commonly discussed concepts of the slip disc, or the acromion that's ripping into a tendon, or the torn rotator cuff. I think when you provide someone with an explanation to their symptom, people go in to see a health professional, and the first thing they say, when someone says, why have you come to see me today? Tell me your story. Oh, it's really sore. I can't sleep. I can't work. And that pain then gets processed through a series of orthopedic tests typically, and then imaging typically, and then a pathoanatomical diagnosis is given. And I think that's where the fragility comes. And people are trying to reframe that model, and to their credit, and as I mentioned, you and many others, trying to reframe that model. It's a difficult uphill road, but I think that's what is polarizing clinicians, and obviously the more important person in healthcare, the patient.
And with your journey's been one that lots of interconnecting. You mentioned a Venn diagram with regards to, say, biopsychosocial, and then many other bubbles surrounding that, of course. But then I think that you, as a clinician first and foremost, and still obviously see clearly a passion for that, an educator. Then there's been areas of almost health policy with regards to then some of the work that you did with changing minds of surgeons, and breaking out of the physios talking to physios type thing. I'm fascinated, because I really don't know as to how did that happen quite naturally, because there was a time where you were especially quite the heretic amongst orthopedic surgeons with regards to the debunking, the challenging of the impingement narrative, which, whilst you're still a thorn in many people's sides in that direction, as many therapists are. But how did that come about? I'm fascinated.
I'm a thorn in many people's sides, full stop. You know that. So as I said, I really wanted to contribute, and I wanted to show the world that posture did follow the rules that have been presented in the last 70, 100 years, that have become part of our DNA and our profession. And I thought I could build the narrative around impingement, which, when I started my PhD in the 1990s, around about the time they invented the wheel, I thought that those two would blend really well together. And it just surprised me that everything I was doing was just suggesting that none of the beautiful theories, the hypotheses about posture and muscle imbalance that were just so poetic, really, and how this led to that and led to that, weren't really substantiated. And then that also became, and I love medical history. I love reading medical history, and some of my favorite books are medical history books. And so you remember that on my next birthday, Jack. and so you go back to the 1970s when Charles Neer, that very famous American orthopedic surgeon, said 95% of all rotator cuff problems are caused by irritation by the acromion. And if you go back and read that paper today with today's mindset, you're saying, oh, this is a blog. This is not a scientific paper. This is an opinion piece, very valid, very interesting. But that blog changed medical history, and millions of people around the world have had their acromions removed on the basis of a thought. And then, if you look at everything that sort of followed that, it took me a long time to have the courage to press the send button to a publisher for a paper I wrote in 2011, basically asking, is this condition an illusion? And I got a lot of uncomfortable correspondence from physios, from doctors, from a lot of people, patients. And then I had a bit more courage a few years later to say, is this modern day bloodletting, just done in a cleaner way, but with anesthetic, but is it still just bloodletting? Like, we laugh at what people were doing 200-300 years ago in Europe as considered high-level medical care, and as far as I could see, that's what this acromioplasty for impingement was offering. And I think that's been borne out with studies from the Netherlands, Dr. Henkes's group, studies from Oxford, the Seesaw group, studies from Finland, the FIMPAC studies. It's really hard to find any justification. And then when you extend that field of view and look at surgery in non-traumatic presentations for the shoulder, where the main presentation is pain, there's research today, a good synthesis of research that says if a patient's main complaint is pain, that's when an invasive procedure is most likely going to be a placebo. And I think that's what we see with so much, the labral repairs, the biceps tenodesis, with many rotator cuff repairs. When it's compared to placebo surgery, it's probably not much more than that. And as we emerge from this horrible period in our history, human history, where every country's, or most countries, are suffering financially and every health system is struggling, we've got to use this terrible time as an opportunity to sit down and say, how do we offer quality care and reduce the cost of care so that we've got the money saved available for cancer research, to help homeless people, help children catch up with their education, help families catch up with the social problems that they've been faced in the last few years. And I don't know, I think there's just a race. Everyone was saying the first lockdown, how beautiful it is to see a blue sky, listen to the birds. It's going to be different, but it just seems to me a race to the bottom again, which is quite sad, actually.
Yeah, as for how can we prioritize and how can we learn lessons, it's just a fascinating thing that some people do, just get their head back in the sand at soonest convenience, can't they? But one of the things, when I think back to my early career, so around that time, I remember that paper well, because it was such a formative time for me. Graduated in 2010, 2011, I was in my first MSK department. Cannot believe my luck, but my first boss was Mike Stewart. My first clinical lead was Mike Stewart in Kent. Unbelievable opportunity for me to accelerate in the shores of Margate. But anyway, a couple of the team in there had been on your course, and the most thumbed through book in the department became some of your slides that you've given as a handout. And it was something that, the reason I bring that up is because around that time there were many people, not many, lots of people that were becoming sort of, there's something bigger than our tissues here, and we need to start being more holistic and things. But one of the things that really stood me out for understanding and studying your work was that whilst you were making that case, you simultaneously still had an interest and respect for morphology and some of the archaeological literature. I remember some of your slides that described some of the reasons why that narrative is compelling, about Neer's narrative about we're sort of under-evolved for some of these tasks. But then the way that meant that you then were able to sort of say, what if we've been sucked in by this because it sort of makes sense, but we've missed this opportunity that something subtly different, such as the fact that we might be overloaded. within that morphology. It's not that it's irrelevant, it's just that it's not dangerous inherently. It's just that combined with this sort of a more of a capacity model around that seemed to make sense. And I remember how much more persuasive that was to me and to my colleagues around that time than others that were just, mainly in other body parts, kind of just saying, well, that's only part of it. And actually, you need to jump all the way to neurobiology, right? You need to leave that behind. Whereas you didn't seem to jump that sharp. Now, I don't know if that was a conscious thing, but I do remember that being that you were someone that could help us understand things, that wasn't dismissing things out of hand, and certainly influenced me and others I've spoken to, especially in prep for this podcast, in a similar way. So I do ask, was that conscious? Was it just you were still so interested in that? And how did that sort of come about as you were forming these opinions?
Wow. Okay. I wish I had been that articulate then. That paper would have been much better received. I'm really jealous. Anyway, so yeah. So if we were kicking around together when I was 7 years old or 8 years old, and we were put in a toy shop, I would have gone to every counter to check what was on offer. I think my personality has been that almost my whole life. I'm interested in lots of different things, and maybe it's a problem because it spreads you thin, and maybe you could go deeper into different things than you have. I remember listening to Mark Knopfler 100 years ago. I went to a concert in Melbourne, and he was talking a bit during the concert and said, he just loves getting deep into the guitar. And I didn't really understand what that meant, but now I think I do, in terms of the wood and the strings and the history of it. And I like to get deep into as many things, but it's impossible. But I love history because it tells us how we got here. And I love evolution, although you can't say that in some places I've taught. I love evolution because it explains so much. And the world's weird, isn't it? I mean, our profession's weird. I mean that in a positive way, in the sense that,
sure.
Maybe that's politically correct. When I started my career, it was about posture, it was about manual therapy, and then we rejected all that, and it became about muscle imbalance, and we rejected that, and it became about pain, and it's always I just guess it's people who are good-hearted, big-hearted, and wanting to really offer good care to people who come in desperate situations more than not, and we just forever like a pendulum swinging to the next best thing. That's and I guess I did consciously try to look at the different silos, and when more knowledge became available, it became very clear that biomechanics is important, we can't reject it, but actually social determinants of health are probably more important, and the environment people live in. And I was privileged during the pandemic to be able to join the vaccination team, and for right or for wrong, I was in the community vaccination team. We were going to people's houses, and and I know I've lived a privileged life, and I know I have warm food every day and a shower every day, and I know all those things. But in this country, which is, you probably know, is it the 5th or 6th or 7th biggest economy in the world, to go to a flat without a balcony, where 3 generations of one family were living in the same 2-bedroom place, with no internet or very limited, just the environmental impact of that, how the environment must influence health and psychological well-being, the ability to exercise. When we're told you can't go outside because we're in a lockdown, and you weren't invited to one of those parties. So health is so complicated, and I've tried. I know I'm not answering your question. I do meander a bit, don't I? So it's such a big Venn diagram that's forever moving, forever changing. We're learning so much from people around us who are doing some research in those areas.
It sounds like it was almost by disposition you were likely to draw on whatever would inform your opinions rather than get possibly sucked into next shiny thing because you wouldn't have necessarily lost interest in the other bits. And I think that what you've said there,
no, I didn't. It's very hard for me to let go of things.
Right.
And it's my personality, and it's good in some ways and really bad in some ways. And
right.
But when I feel confident enough to let go, it's sometimes a bit cathartic, really. Like I also wanted to show the world about trigger points, and some of my early research
right, really.
was I thought there's this new technology on the scene. It's called ultrasound. Surely, if there's a trigger point, we can see it. And I managed, very early in my career to get a publication in the journal Pain, which was, opened a lot of the fact that as a physio I was able to publish in Pain was a big deal. And what we did was we put 250 cent, like a 50 pence, circular 50 pence size circle around where the trigger point was and the contralateral other side, and then sent that patient off to a radiologist, an ultrasonographer, who could say what they saw on one side, what they saw on the other side, thinking that the blinded to the fact of which side the patient was experiencing symptoms with, and thinking that if they looked and they would see that what this trigger point was in existence, what changes with it, and nothing was there. And then studies I did on the reliability of finding trigger points. I got two of the very best people in Melbourne, as in Australia, to participate in the study, and they couldn't even agree where the trigger points were. And that's what was early on in my career, and it just but then you think, well, I've done so many of these courses, it's so hard to let go, but eventually you can let go.
And that's, I suppose, really interesting there, that it has its upside, where there's a studiousness that you can be persistent and to make sure you don't lurch too quickly away. And you mentioned that as the pendulum swings, which we often use, an apt metaphor for us all, but it can't become a wrecking ball because of the way in which we don't. It's so young, some of this stuff. We can't be so arrogant as to think that we need to leave that behind, and that the further that can swing away from it, the better. But one of the things that I'd be just interested in is, if you've said that it can have some negative effects in the fact that you would struggle, that something's a bit stickier or something you're into that you'd find difficult to leave behind. Could you think of things whereby that has been quite challenging, where it's probably been stickier than now in hindsight you'd liked it to have been, and you'd have moved away from it sooner? What would that look like for you?
Another lovely question. So I guess for me, for a lot of people, my generation, when I finished physio undergraduate, like I said, I wanted to be the very best fixer I could be. So I did every course I could possibly do. I did, trigger points and acupressure and acupuncture. I worked really hard because it was very hard to get into the postgraduate manipulative therapy course in Melbourne. I think I got in a few years after I graduated. I had to get references. It was really hard. And Jeff Maitland was teaching in those days still, and I had the privilege of, he taught us a little bit. He flew from Adelaide to Melbourne, where I was living. And I really tried to be very hard with that. And then the year after that, I went to Perth to do the sports physiotherapy year. And I guess what I couldn't reconcile the fact I'd spent so much time and effort becoming this manual therapist person. And then when I was reading literature and research that was being published, it was challenging a lot of what I was had learned and was believing and telling myself. It had become part of my DNA. And then I did a course. It was the first course I taught. Oh my gosh, I'm losing my mind watching a man have a TIA. I did a course in a country that wasn't an English-speaking country, and I had that reflective moment in the evening when I had my first vodka shot, thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if I was doing a Maitland course in this country where I couldn't understand the teacher? And I was just watching the techniques and trying to emulate them, trying to copy them. And if one week it was a Maitland course, and then the next week it was exactly the same situation. I couldn't understand what was being said to me, but they were doing a trigger point course. And the third week, it was an acupressure course. And I wonder if after 3 weeks, I would have actually thought that maybe what I had done was attended the same course for 3 weeks in a row, because I think what has happened in all of our cultures, we've all identified that touch has this profound connection between people. When your children fall over, Jack, they hurt their elbow, you rub their elbow. It's not that you're unblocking the bladder meridian or whatever meridian goes down the arm. It's the fact that you're putting in a different sensation into their nervous system, and maybe it's masking the pain that they're feeling, and they know that their dad loves them, and he's touching with care, and he's touching with empathy, and I wonder if all of our cultures, because everywhere you go in the world, touch has been a feature of health, and continues to be a feature of health. And I just wonder if the touch around the world is all the same, but the thing that's different is the philosophy why we touch. So we've created narratives around, Jeff Maitland talking about accessory movements of joints, and Travell and Simon talking about deactivating trigger points, and maybe in traditional Chinese medicine, unblocking meridians. What's the plural of was it meridian?
Oh no. As I've had to clarify many times on and off air, contrary to my surname sounding Oriental, I would not know, and I'm not a Chinese medic. So people have often asked me.
It's an English word, Jack. Is it meridian?
Meridia? Let's go with meridia.
Look, we've invented. What was the first thing we invented today that we're patenting?
That's the massive wax bath, isn't it?
The body wax bath. That's brilliant.
Is that going to be like a team? The old rugby baths. Is that going to be like a full-on team experience?
Infection control. You've got to think infection control. It's a different world.
Anyway, Meridia.
Okay. So no one's going to listen to this podcast, are they? Anyway, so I don't know where we're talking about that. Yeah. So I just wonder if we've all created a philosophy around why we touch, and the touch is all the same. Because if you look at the research on the touch, whether it's manual therapy to do accessory movements on joints, where's the evidence for it? How can, thank goodness we can't do an accessory movement and actually cause an accessory glide on a vertebral bone, because it would kink the spinal cord. You want to do that in their right mind. So in our desire to help people, we have created a narrative around touch. But it's hugely powerful to hold somebody's hand who's in deep emotional distress. To put your hand on their shoulder if they give you permission to do that. And I just wonder if that's extended into the therapeutic. And so it's very hard to let go of touch. And I don't think we should let go of touch. I just think it's just another thing in musculoskeletal practice we need to reframe. It's
Two things.
Sorry.
Two things. No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Two things that have happened simultaneously for me, so I find it really difficult to uncouple them, is becoming a dad and having that interaction where the context specificity of me rubbing said elbow compared to a stranger doing pretty much exactly the same thing, but having a very different effect on said sore elbow. That has happened to me at the same time as the pandemic, in which we've literally quite legally and ethically, we've not been touching each other nearly as much as we would have been, and there's been a paucity of that, and all of the consequence of it, which many would argue, including me, that was under not considered within our trade-offs. But I think that that is something that needs to be understood better and conserved where appropriate. But I think the specificity of it is what you've just nailed as well, is that for years we've thought that the part of the fixer mentality, as well as our perception of the body, was so strange that we thought that we could be really particular, and that the specificity wasn't coming from the context and from how it made someone feel or how they perceived you, but the literal things, right? The consciousness of the person was irrelevant. Well, if it was safe to, we'd be doing this under anaesthetic, right? We'd be doing grade 1 mobilizations on someone as a means of, because we were doing things to them. I wonder if I can just sort of pivot a little bit then on specificity to where your sense is with the shoulder. That's another area where some people incredibly specific, partly with hands, but even more so often with rehabilitation, with regards to what corner of the rotator cuff are you loading with that particular band, and even what tension of band, under what overlap have you put that band. Some people very particular. Obviously, I'm being a bit cartoonish there, exaggerated, but then there are others that are so far the other way, in which it's non-specific. In fact, really, it's let it rest, go for a walk, and be super general. And here's some mindfulness training. Again, I'm being a bit cartoonish there, but I just wondered, where possible, if you just invite your thoughts on where you found yourself with regards to how specific it would be, and in what cases, or how you would differentiate as to when to zoom in and when to zoom out.
Okay. Thank you for asking that question. So again, everything evolves over time, doesn't it? And some research that we published last year, it was a systematic review where we looked at motor control, which is a term I really don't like. Right. Movement facilitation, but it's a term people understand, even though it's not. Yeah, sure. It's not definable in our profession easily. Matt Lowe did a beautiful paper. I'm sure you've read it.
It's great, really.
Yeah, I asked him to write that paper, and when I'm doing the viewpoint editing for the journal with Chad Cook, and it was just poetic, his paper, and so we looked at motor control, whatever that means, which is basically, I guess, if you're learning to do something, your children are learning to do something, they're learning the coordination of that and getting sensory feedback, verbal from you and their mum, and all those different things. And then there's the acquisition of strength, the acquisition of hypertrophy, or whatever you want to call it, force production. And the systematic review that we published with the forest plots for upper and lower limbs seemed to suggest that motor control have a faster reduction in pain and disability, faster than a muscle a resistance training program. But also, resistance training programs are so valuable. I mean, one of the greatest gifts a person can give their older version of themselves in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 50 years, depending on how old you are, is the gift of strength. If you can't do a certain number of sit-to-stands in 30 seconds, it predicts that you're not going to be physically independent. You're not going to get in and out of a car or up and down stairs, and later part of life might be a little bit more miserable if you don't have the strength. If you had the opportunity and you didn't take advantage of that opportunity, because not everybody does. And so for me, rehabilitation today of the shoulder, but I guess it would be the same. I'd probably lose bladder control if somebody came in with a knee problem into the clinic. I'd remember where the knee is, and I remember what it's used for. I know it bends, but that's it. I'd have to find the ultrasound machine. Anyway, for me, it is a huge amount of education. An RCT we've just submitted compared education and motor control, education and strengthening for the shoulder. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of education. And we have got to become so much better in our profession. And it's not just give a piece of paper and tick, because some people can't read. The average age of literacy in the United Kingdom is 9 years of age. We're all privileged people in our profession. We've got, and so, and for some people are dyslexic, even if, very clever, but reading is not their preferred learning style. It's not mine. I can read, I can write, but it's my preferred learning style is observation. And so we have to provide education in 3 formats. And it's not enough just to provide it. We also have to, like the same thing, you ask people, how are you getting on with your exercises? We need to talk about how to get on with their education. And one of the ideas that I suggested in the RCT, the Canadian RCT we just finished, was let's provide education, but also let's say to patients, what was the most important message in that education, but what do you need clarification on? What do you want more? And so we could tailor make education for people. So education is critically important. Developing a strong therapeutic alliance is essential. You've got to trust the patient, they've got to trust you. When a patient says, listen, this week it just was impossible to exercise, there was too much else going on, we've got to not be judgmental about that. We've got to understand that, I'm sure you have weeks where, the children have been unwell, unfortunately, and just everything else isn't the priority. And so, we all have that experience. So being non-judgmental, good therapeutic alliance. And for me, shoulder rehab today is starting with a motor control program, or whatever you want to call it. It then is going to blend into a muscle performance part of that program. And then the final part, for me, the motor control part would be, if we had 100 slices of a cucumber, the motor control part would be slice number 1. The slice number 2 would be starting to get the muscle performance, and slice number 3 to 100 is going to be restoring function. So trying to identify as scientifically as possible what a safe starting point for that individual is, where they are. It doesn't matter if you were doing 60 push-ups in the gym before this started. How many push-ups have you done in the last 4 weeks? None. Okay, well, then we've got to find a safe entry point to get you back to that level that you were at. And let's try and exceed that level, but let's do it in a safe way, because what the tendons don't want, what the muscles don't want, to experience too much change. And so, we still can use the biomechanical, our biomechanical knowledge about, what goes on at a cellular level inside a tendon if you expose it to too much load, what goes on into a tendon at a biomechanical level if you expose it to too much negative lifestyle load. So for me, those are the 3 important parts. But I'm also mindful I'm a very privileged person. And I know that there are single parents out there who are doing 2 jobs and are struggling to make ends meet and going to the food bank, and you give them a formal exercise program, where are they going to fit that in their daily life? Impossible. So you have to then find ways of understanding the physical activities that they are doing, can do. Maybe when they get to their apartment block, instead of taking the elevator straight away, you could climb a flight of stairs this week, and next week 2 flights of stairs, and maybe get off the bus or stop early if that's possible, and maybe push the children in a pram to school if that's, if you've got a choice between that and a car or something. You might not have the car, but so we have to also think about we have to be that individually patient focused, and what is in that patient's environment that they can do. And beyond that, I think our profession really needs to go and become, go into the primary schools, the infant schools, and ask people, do they want, do you want to become Raheem Sterling or somebody like that, or an equivalent of whatever. You've got to be very careful with football in this country. And what would it take to become that, and the importance of having some broccoli. And if one person listens to the physio, the band 5 physio that's gone into that school, part of their rotation is preventative and promoting health, that's going to downstream, it's going to reduce pressure on the NHS. And we've got everything wrong. And I know that wasn't your question, but it was my opportunity.
No, I can see where you're going with that, and it definitely answers the question, because you're saying that you've certainly err on the side of the general, get the basics right, and then the specificity will sort of find itself. If you don't mind, I just want to try and use a sort of cobbled together case study based on that. Really, imagining someone, say, who has a number of different comorbid factors that mean that they're not an athletic throwing shoulder, but say they're a dog walker that then throws their tennis
throwing
ball
frisbees to their grandchildren.
Yeah, absolutely. So then they developed a shoulder problem that for the sake of shortcuts we're feeling is rotator cuff related, and then I suppose I'm inviting thoughts on, because the definition of terms, which is great, and please, for those listening, do read Matt's article on that, because it's where his penchant for philosophical language and defining terms prior to getting stuck into argument is just brilliant. But I would say I want to try and understand whether or not, in that instance, would it be, say, this person is moving badly by the textbook, and also it's a little bit clunky and things, and we're struggling to understand whether that's because of pain or it could have preceded it. But then there are some that would say that a graded throwing program, regardless, right? So we're just in a situation, well, let's just throw it a little bit for a bit and let it calm down and apply relative rest principles that then can just graded exposure, and that is the center of it. That is everything that they would do. And then, but in other circumstances, would we do some form of motor control sort of learning behavior? Then we might try to actually look at strengthening your cuff. And then we aspire to the throwing as a means of that functional chunk that you were talking about. So I've got a sense that I might be sort of inviting a bit of an it depends on various different things answer. But I just mean on those two things, do you have a bias to one or the other of those, or could you just reflect on that as a case study?
Okay, so if we take that patient, if there's three twins, no, it's not three twins, three
triplets.
Okay. So I'm not good with words, am I? I don't know the plural of whatever word, meridian. And so the first one was very irritable in the sense of their symptoms, not the personality, or was extremely frightened about the fact that they've been given an ultrasound scan and it's demonstrated a tear, or they've been told they've got this huge acromion ripping into their tendon. If that was the first presentation, then I would be starting with a motor control movement support program and then blending into the others. Gotcha. Triplet number 2 comes in and has no pain at rest, no problem sleeping at night, is only getting symptoms when they throw, and maybe after the 20th throw. So it's not an irritable presentation. I don't see why you'd even contemplate a motor control program. There's no point to do it. There's no symptoms to try and modify, or whatever you want to call it. And I'd be starting at the second part of what I would see as shoulder rehab, which would be, and I don't think isometric testing is particularly useful for the shoulder. I can't comment about other parts of the body, but if we're talking shoulder, I don't see it being valuable, especially isometric testing in standing. But I've much more interested, and I've got some research going on at the moment looking at repetitions to pain, repetitions to fatigue. Right. And so it might be that this person can do, on the asymptomatic arm, which is really important to test if there is one, 10 kilo repetitions before. So they've got a 10 repetition max is 10 kilos for that particular movement. And they can do 10 kilos here, but after number 3, it gets really sore. And maybe has identified, who knows why, a deficit. So for me, the starting point for that individual will be building up isometric strength, eccentric strength, and heavy slow resistance strength for that particular movement. Spend some time on that and then blend into the functional program, the throwing program. And if there was absolutely no deficits when you were testing, the 10 RM was equal on both sides and there was no deficit found, and I'd made sure that the pain the patient was experiencing wasn't referred from the neck region, the thoracic region, the abdominal region, because people unfortunately do sometimes present with pain that's not, they assume it's the shoulder because they feel it in the shoulder, and it might not even be when they're throwing, but they think it is. As much as I can to be a good clinical detective to ensure that it's not something else that's not part of my scope of practice, then I'd probably go for a more functional program, like you suggested. So the answer was, as you predicted, it depends.
And I think, is it right for me to then think that you don't therefore consider it to be an essential prerequisite to improve, say, movement control, motor control, call it what we will, as a as a building block, because of the nature that people moving badly is therefore going to be bad for them either then or in the future. It depends on the access need for actually gaining compliance and making it accessible for them.
Absolutely. For me, the motor control program that I use is something called shoulder symptom modification, which I know for some people is the devil's work, but it's just simply a movement. It's just a way of, if you've got a patient. So a video I show in my courses is this Adonis of a man. He's a bodybuilder, mechanical engineer, but his passion's bodybuilding, and he was told 2 years before I saw him in the National Health Service that the reason for his shoulder pain was this acromion damaging his tendon. He did not move his shoulder for 2 years because he was frightened of ripping the tendon, and he wouldn't be symmetrical and couldn't participate in international bodybuilding competitions. And the surgeon said, you got to operate. The person he trusted most in the world was his father, who said, I've seen people have operations that don't always come out as well as we would like. I'm recommending don't do it. So he was paralyzed between the surgeons, his dad. He didn't move his arm for 2 years. His girlfriend was getting him dressed. He wasn't working. It was, and so for him, when I said, move your arm out to the side, he was trying to explain to me about this. He used the word, those ice creams, Cornetto ice creams, those cone ice creams. He said he's got a Cornetto bone in his arm, in his shoulder, sorry. And he could just see it ripping the tendon. And so for him, that movement enhancement facilitation was so valuable. If you'd started him on a shoulder press exercise, it doesn't matter how much education and talking about, it's not going to be damaged. It wasn't going to be anything for him. It wasn't going to move him forwards. And, and at the end of the rehab, it was about 20 weeks, and I interviewed him at the end, and I said, what's it like now? And he said, I'm doing everything that I want to be doing. I'm participating in getting ready for competitions. But he said, I've still got pain. But he's from Iran, and he uses most beautiful poetic language. He said, but it's far pain, which I didn't understand. And on the video, he explains in his culture that far pain means it's not. So I don't know if I had any impact on reducing pain. It just wasn't bothering him anymore. Right. And but his function had improved enormously. So he was able to do 58 pull-ups before his shoulder pain started, which I, of course, acknowledge. Well, everybody can do 58 pull-ups, as I'm trying to flex up a bit here. And so, this guy hadn't moved his arm for 2 years, but my aim is always, let's try and meet that. That if he'd got back range of movement, that wouldn't have been rehab for him. We had to get 58 for him to have confidence in his shoulder. And my aim is always, let's try and exceed expectations. Now, I don't have better outcomes than anybody else. No one has better outcomes than anybody else. Sometimes things work out well and sometimes things don't. But he did really well, but he still had pain. And for him, he had to go through that process. He couldn't have started with a functional program. But he had to get to a functional program. And that's where I think our profession needs to go to. We've got to stop trying to be so focused on structural diagnosis, which we cannot do in clinical practice and imaging. As lucky as we are to be within the first generations of people to see inside the body and people who are alive, we still cannot, we don't have an MRI that rings a bell or flashes a light and says that structural change is symptomatic. So I personally think our profession needs to be really focused on function and reduction of disability. And that's with exercise, but we've got to become masters. We've got to become experts in behavioral change. We've got to become much more knowledgeable about lifestyle load, about the impact of poor sleep, about nutrition, smoking, not enough exercise. If we're going to really make a contribution after this pandemic, that's where we got to focus ourselves. And I know that's part of your ethos as well. So I'm sure we're singing from the same.
Yeah, no, it's always well worth reiterating it, and especially our audience needs to hear it from some actual experts, not just me all the time. But I certainly agree.
Where's this expert?
We had 3 S&C coaches on, I think maybe this time last year, that are some of the best and brightest in that game, and it was really, we got so much feedback from the fact that they accept that, taken badly, some of their work is just new age biomedicalism. You know, if it's all about integrating that into a knowledge framework that then inspires people to improve their function. But if you get too stuck into that, then fundamentally all you're doing is you're reducing people to the muscles of which you're trying to get stronger, or thinking of only about capacity. So I think that's certainly something that we need to make sure we get through on. One thing that I remember just as you were speaking there is that some of the, I don't know how early a work it was necessarily, but just another way in which I think you and Jill were doing courses together at the time. And again, I can't recall when, but it was the first time that I'd really seen a really crisp line between clinical practice, evidence, and the way in which that should influence social policy. Because it was, why on earth would the evidence say this, yet we're restricting people to 4 sessions or whatever it was? And it was just like, it's such a, now, as I say, it's like, well, how bad was I as a thinker for that to be so novel? But at the time, it was really that I hadn't joined the dots very easily. Like, there's these injustices, and I'm annoyed about them. And I'm also annoyed about poor evidence translation, and I'm broadcasting by that point about them. But I hadn't necessarily seen just how that's actually quite a clean line, and something that we talked about a lot when we were producing stuff for our reform think tank. But was that something that came naturally to you when you were studying this stuff, and just being like, the application of this is increasingly difficult to do within our healthcare environment? Because it seems that those things just seem to go hand in hand with some of your work around that time.
Yeah. Well, I've got to temper my language. So when I moved to the UK, my plan was to come. I promised my mum I'd be here for a year. That was 22 years ago. So if my mum's listening, I'm so sorry. Anyway, I've ruined her life. And she'll be on the phone to you, Jack. And you don't want to be on the other end of the phone to her.
She's going to come on the podcast soon.
Yeah, how I ruined her life. Anyway, so and I had this job in London in a major teaching hospital, and I just loved it. I was the research coordinator for the department, and I could work clinically. And one of the things that we did was that we could show in some areas that we could treat 26 patients with physio with the same outcome as one surgical procedure, and with the same, the same quality of outcome in both. Because at that stage, with the introduction of foundation trusts, I don't know if you remember
absolutely.
So foundation trust was something was happening when I first came to the UK, and there was a big rush to become a foundation trust, because then you could charge the Department of Health a tariff for a particular procedure. So let's say a subacromial decompression or rotator cuff repair was £5,000 at that stage. And when I presented it really proudly to the CEO of the trust, what do you mean we can get £5,000 per procedure? And so they hired 2 extra surgeons. And so it was like bizarre to me that on one hand, the Department of Health was saying, let's find ways to be creative and not reduce the quality of care, make it more sustainable, but reduce cost. And the other side, they were saying charges by a tariff because you're a foundation trust. And then managers who were somehow, when I first started my career, the managers were listening to the clinicians saying, this is what we need. How can we create it? And then somewhere it happened, I must have gone to sleep for 20 years and woke up, that all of a sudden the managers, who were often not clinicians, were telling the clinicians what needed to be done, and saying, well, you need to make sure we see our 3,000 people per month. We can only do four treatments per patient. And I was sort of saying to myself, and I can't tell you the number of times I was sitting on the naughty step, the different places I was working, but which is a stupid idea. Don't do that with your children. There's some older person advice to you. The number of times I was on the metaphorical naughty step for saying, well, if you were given a diagnosis of pneumonia and you were told you've got to take 7 days of antibiotics and but we're only going to give you 2, you'd be thinking, that's not healthcare, that's ticking a box. And if the research is saying, like people like Chris Littlewood, who's some, really good research on, what does what is the research telling us? How much treatment do people need or rehab they need? And, numbers like 12 weeks of rehab is fairly accepted now for the shoulder. And on average, if you look at studies that have, done 8 treatments or 20 treatments, but on average, it's around about 12 treatments. So let's say 1 a week. So how can you say that 4's adequate provision? And of course, it will balance out. Some people need a bit of education. Some people telehealth is fine. But a lot of times, especially in the way things happen, the chronicity or persistency of conditions that happen because of the delivery of healthcare, it's not enough.
Some people, I've got into trouble sometimes over the years.
You've also been on the naughty step.
But yeah, absolutely. Metaphorical and very real. That's the thing. You should do it with kids, but I think probably I've at times deserved to be on the naughty step as an adult, for sure. So I'll accept that. But there's been times where I've got into bother because whilst there's some brilliant managers and there's some people that are polymathic and that's just a natural step for them to create and exert their influence in a really positive way. There are also people that ended up moving that way in part because they were they weren't into the clinical practice, or that was something that they moved away from fairly swiftly in such a way that it's then a huge irony, and even beyond that into policy, and a huge irony that they would then start dictating down to a very changeable landscape clinically, because it doesn't take many years, not necessarily out of the game, but the patient, if your patient mileage decreases, then of course then things can mature and change, especially in the time I've been qualified. I cannot believe it, and I speak to people like yourself in many decades. There's been some real seismic shifts in many ways, some similarities, of course, and some things we've needed to regress back to sensibly. But it's such a shame that sometimes characters or policies or procedures or people, instead of, I say that really, if it's only evidence, it should be used to, a paper can be used to influence and to persuade and to start to shape practice. But if you get a few pieces of evidence together, that becomes a decent weapon to beat someone with, and that feels like then what happens, at least metaphorically, in departments with guidance and guidelines, and this is how many sessions you should and shouldn't have as a means of then shaping it, which is definitely not an outcome that very evidence they're talking about is powerful for. What we might want to try to look at is how can these things shape social change whilst we kind of get that balance between advocacy and making sure we get the right people to hear that message, but then also not lose touch with the fact that someone's got to be doing the doing as well. Someone's got to be in there treating the patients, and we've got to have a huge respect for that clinical frontline role, which is becoming somewhat ever more complex in some ways, especially with regards to the emotional drain that can sometimes be, and needing to make sure we patients get heard. I feel like sometimes people are worried that that's the thing that's drawing them thin, is that they see these social determinants of the health, some of the stuff we've talked about today, as well as the fact that the injustices in policy and the wider macro politics, the hypocrisies, the things that I know put a bad taste in yours and everyone's mouths, but then also fight that fight, but then also not lose touch with the clinical. Any top tips on that? I know it's a tough one.
Well, that's I'm levitating off my chair here, but we need 2 days to discuss that. And, we need a group of people, but, some of the things, just pick up a couple of those things. I've observed some of the best managers I've had have been physiotherapists or occupational therapists who are the managers of a therapy department and are still having a little bit of clinical work, have decided they want to do that. Some of the worst managers have been people who have not been clinicians, and I've seen it so many times because I have been around for a while, where people come in, make radical changes in the first year, and often it's around about waiting lists, it's often using what you were saying before about the evidence, but how can you use an evidence of an RCT which is so pristine, which doesn't exclude people, which excludes people who are diabetic, women who are pregnant, people who smoke, people whose hobby is jaywalking, people who are old age. You've got a 90-year-old pregnant woman in the clinic whose hobby is jaywalking. Where's the RCT to tell you about that person's care? And so it's really difficult sometimes. Evidence-based practice is really important, but we have to understand we are so early days in evidence-based practice, and we don't have enough data to tell us that this person with this psychosocial profile and these comorbidities and these lifestyle factors, it might be 6 months, and for someone else, we just don't have it, and we're just putting everybody into the same mix. So that's one issue. And often these people would come in, make changes, very radical changes. Second year would be looking for a new job, and third year would move on, using the changes they made as the selling point in their interview. And I know I'm being overly critical and harsh, but that's also another personality.
No, but that is the sort of careerism that can sometimes happen there, and they're playing politics with these departments, and it's the patients that suffer as well as the clinicians that get burnt down on that and can't deliver the care that they know that the patients need. Something you've just reminded me of as well with in primary care, we persuaded GPs to inject a bit less, but then some of them were really upfront and honest with us about the fact that, honestly, if we did anything like what you're describing there, Jack, even though I think you've presented fairly compelling evidence as to why I shouldn't, we would have to close this place in 6 months. It's a big earner for us.
Yes.
Inject, and so they said that all the incentive structures are skewed in the wrong direction, and it's not malleable enough to adjust to that. And so those are the sorts of things where we do need to try and find a balance. But as you're quite right, it take a 2-day summit for us to even move the needle slightly on that. And put one for, well, I suppose I've got a 24-hour podcast coming up soon that I think we'll probably be announcing on this show. So maybe that's something I can make the common theme throughout that if I'm ambitious. What I can't help but ask you, to wrap up really in that direction, is what you see for the future, not necessarily the shoulder or the profession or the MSK industry. I don't really mind, but it's just certainly I look on, and especially having looked back into it and reading some of your seminal works and stuff for prep for this interview, makes me genuinely wonder. There's been times where you have prognosticated really, really well. There's been times where, by your own admission, you've felt that it's gone in a different direction than you'd have expected. But what is your anticipation, or what would you like to hope for in the future in our game, and particularly in and around the shoulder? I can't help but ask.
Well, I think I don't know if my generation of physios has been particularly helpful for your generation of physios. And for mistakes I've made, which have been many, I apologize. And I've tried to rectify. And I think there are people who've sort of changed a lot during their career based on discussion, listening to TED Talks, listening to your own inner thoughts, what you're reading, what research you're doing, and what people seeking care need, what you, not being paternalistic there, but that what the research is telling us we need to be offering. I don't know if we really need specialisms in our profession. I don't know. I think that was valuable because, like a lot of things, evolution, we need to learn things before we can maybe unpack them a little bit or reframe them a little bit. And I guess my whole career, maybe my whole life in different ways, has been reframing the last part of it. And I think the way I would answer that question, and I'm sure when I'm sitting in an old age home rocking away in my rocking chair, you're going to come over and say, listen, you were completely wrong during that podcast, maybe, but or maybe you won't. But I just wonder if the conversation we had a few minutes ago about what can our profession do to help contribute to improved health, try and prevent, make physical activity. It doesn't have to be in the gym, but make ideally social physical activity how can we contribute to healthy environments where it's safe to get on a bicycle, safe to get on a scooter, that the environment to walk in is safe for women? And, how can we contribute to, we published on that last year, the environmental, how can we promote physical activity as part of, what we're doing, and physical transport of what we're doing? How can we learn? How can our university education filter out the stuff that maybe was good 20, 30, 40 years ago, but maybe bring in stuff about lifestyle overload? And how can we support people, and how can we work with other professions to reduce the impact of lifestyle overload? And I think we've seen that so acutely during this pandemic. People are frightened about their children's education. Have I got a job? It's just magnified those particular issues. And the difference between the first lockdown and the subsequent lockdowns, how people, responded, and it just people became overwhelmed. So lifestyle load, and of course, how do we educate people that the most important thing for them is to try and prevent the occurrence of some of these things that they're going to live with for the rest of their lives? And I think the big one for me is we need to reframe what a musculoskeletal problem is. And if you allow me just 2 minutes and to finish, and that will,
absolutely,
I promise I won't say any more than that. But one of the proudest papers I've written was the one with Peter O'Sullivan in 2018, I think, where I wrote a lot of it. I sent it to him. Of course, our relationship is I write things, he changes everything, and he's very much the alpha male. Like Jill Cook was the alpha male when I was teaching. Everyone seems to be the alpha male. Anyway, so you can be the alpha male in this podcast. And for me, if we can educate our society that persistent, like a lot of musculoskeletal problems, like a cold, it's unwanted, it always comes at the wrong time, but it's going to get better. It's going to get better quickly. But for the people with persistent musculoskeletal pain, how can we get people to understand that they should be thinking along the lines that this is not fixable, this is not curable, but we can work really hard to reduce the disability? Like, if you think about diabetes, no one's going to go into a clinic with diabetes and expect to be cured. They want to be educated what it is. They need to learn the short and long-term consequences of having this condition, and what we can do as health professionals, what that patient has to do in terms of self-management to bring the blood sugars into a level that we would consider normal, and then spend the rest of your days until someone wins a Nobel Prize for medicine for the cure of diabetes, trying to look healthily after your lifestyle. Stop smoking, reduce smoking, sleep well, reduce anxiety, participate in exercise, eat well. And of course, if needed, it can be supplemented with medicine. And in truth, the treatment of every persistent every persistent health problem is the same management. Someone with asthma, stop smoking, sleep well, eat well, exercise. And if you need, replace the metformin with a bronchodilator. High blood pressure, sleep well, eat well, all the same lifestyle factors. And if you needed, replace the bronchodilator with a calcium channel blocker, ACE inhibitor, beta blocker. But the management is the same, but there's no cure. But if we work hard together, we can reduce the disability of this condition. And that's how people have to see, and what our profession, in my opinion, needs to do about persistent musculoskeletal problems. We don't offer cures, we don't offer fixes. We offer support and coaching and empowerment, and we help people when they have relapses and blips on the way, which happens with blood sugars. You don't give up on the treatment for diabetes because the blood sugars are out of control. You reframe it, you recalibrate. And that's what I think we need to be doing: prevention and reframing, I think, and not specialism. I don't think specialism is so important, but I'm sure there's counter arguments to that.
One of the things that has been fascinating to flick through your upcoming, soon-to-be-out book, and thank you for that advanced copy, but it's been such an interesting thing to see how thorough, how many different areas, some of which you would expect and some of which you wouldn't expect. Chapters on uncertainty and admissions of when it's vague. From textbooks that used to be matter of fact to ones of which will allow themselves to sort of muse and to discuss the oohs and ahs. It's just so interesting to see your journey and that of your colleagues and contributors represented in that book. Could you just tell us a little bit about that and how people are going to be able to get access to that, which will be out soon?
Thanks for the opportunity. So if people pre-register, the book's coming out, I would have hoped it would have been available already, but there's always things going on at the moment, trucks in Dover, if you register for it now, I think there's a discount on the Handspring website for people who pre-register for the purchase. It was a COVID project. It was offered to me. I've said no to writing books for a long time, but it was a COVID project. One project, and it's not my book. I'm just the facilitator of people who've inspired me in my career, people who I've learned from, who've changed my direction. So I've asked as many of those. Some people said no because they didn't want to be involved or couldn't be involved. But in the main, I think there's 115 or 116 contributors. Some of them are very early in their career, but really impressive early in their career. So that's part of succession planning that I'm trying to contribute to. And some people are even further in their career than I am. And it was just so amazing that during this difficult time, people were so generous, volunteering their knowledge and contributing suggestions to make it better. It was just lovely. But the first chapter is the patient's voice, and I really wanted that to be the theme of the book, that the most important person in healthcare is the patient. It's not me, it's not the doctor, it's no one else, it's the patient. So we had their voices, and it was really lovely, and it's the theme through the book. But chapter 10, which I think is the chapter you're referring to, I'm hoping that that people in the future, when I'm long gone, might consider taking this book into the future. And chapter 10 was what we know, what we think we know, but we actually don't know, and what we actually don't know. And so we had about 30 contributors to that chapter. And so the challenge was for future researchers, future clinicians, if there are future editions of this book, to try and fill in the gaps so that maybe future editions, there's less uncertainty or there's different sorts of uncertainty. And that was the purpose of that chapter.
That makes sense. And I hope, I think there's good reason from this podcast and all that surrounds it that we can be optimistic in that direction because of the sort of, we are seeking to right wrongs. We're holding our hands up where we need to, and we're aspiring to new knowledge for the right reasons. And so I thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for this opportunity.
It's been great.
I want one of those T-shirts.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll get one in the post, especially. Yeah. That sounds brilliant. Thanks again. And
right. Thank you very much.
I'll hit the big red button. And that was session 99. Huge thanks, of course, to Jeremy. Great chat with him. It was really interesting to get his views and lessons learned as well. That's the thing, is we throw him back over quite a long period of time. What did go as he expected, what hadn't, that sort of stuff I found really interesting. And as I said at the start, sort of Jeremy Lewis comes on the podcast, and maybe I'll come to kick myself for this, but it's like, do you hone in on a particular topic or get stuck into the clinical nitty-gritty and styles of practice and that sort of stuff? Or do you go more big picture and certainly reflect some of my understanding of his journey and his career and stuff like that? And that's what I chose to do. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. And certainly I know I'll hear from you whether you did or you didn't. That's the nature of the beast. So do give us a shout on social media. Keep an eye out on social media, of course, for more information about the 100th episode, the 24-hour podcast marathon for charity. The charity we've chosen, the cause we've chosen is Freehab. If you've not heard about Freehab, then please do look them up. You'll find all about them on our social media channels as well. But a fantastic, innovative intervention by Ollie Coburn and his team, who have created a social enterprise that is going to sit well between the public and private sectors to deliver quality rehabilitation for those that can't afford, on a donation-only model, by people donating their time to make sure that they fill the gap that is currently massively existent and increasing between public and private services in the UK. So do check them out, keep an eye out for us. We'll be certainly singing their praises and telling you more about what's to come in that 100th episode. I'm really looking forward to it, but also a little bit nervous. It's a bit of a mental idea. Please do get involved in it. And thank you as ever. And I'm sure I'm going to get plenty of chance to say this on air over that 24-hour marathon. But thank you so much for all your support over the years. It's just an unbelievable journey that we've been on. Of course, it will continue. But as far as this format goes, this is me signing out for the very last time, which is a weird one. It really is. So you've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast, discussing Physio Matters because physio matters. Bye for now.